Oh, okay, let's begin. Guidelines for members of the Ananda Sevaka order, expanded out to be simply the Ananda Way of Life. So let's say a prayer and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to make our respect and receptivity a central thread in our lives, that everything we do is in reference to your presence within and all around us. Help us to spontaneously think first, how can I serve? How can I love God more? How can I live in harmony with thy ray? Transform us so that right living is not a discipline, but a longing of the heart. We are your children. Bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, my friends, we are in Article 4 still about home life. We've talked about how the home is a temple. We've talked about how we should relate to people in our own home. Yesterday we talked about the benefits of having a meditation area or a meditation room as the central defining reality of your home. And here we have a short paragraph which is very simple. Strictly prohibited to all Ananda members is the recreational use, both on and off the property, of alcoholic beverages and hallucinogenic or other drugs. An exception to the proscription against these may be allowed for medicinal needs. Alcohol and drugs of all kinds that are designed not to improve the physical condition of the body, but only to ease the strain of human life. When we've, at Ananda Village, even quite apart from these guidelines for conduct, we would often say that there were only 3 rules. And I've only been able to think of 2 of them. No, oh, alcohol and drugs are 2. That's why. Lately I've been trying to figure out what the 3 rules were. No alcohol, no drugs, and at Ananda Village, no dogs. Dogs has no spiritual basis. It's not like there's something spiritually wrong about having dogs. But living in the country, as we did up there where all of this started, the dogs, if they run free, they form into packs and they chase the wildlife, and dogs bark. And when you live out in the country, one dog barking way over there can be heard way over here. And it just was impractical to have dogs in the setting in which we were living, which is actually really unfortunate in many ways, because children love to grow up with pets, and many people find one of the ways that they relate to the divine is through animals. And dogs are, Master said that dogs, monkeys, and horses are the 3 most advanced animal species. I say this because I do lament it, but it's been difficult. Now I live in an urban community where we live in an apartment complex. And again, the very close quarters makes it extremely difficult to have dogs. So people have cats and hamsters and birds and various other things that you can do to allow us to relate to Divine Mother's unique manifestations. However, alcohol and drugs, and by that I mean the word that people have now is recreational use, which is that it's not mandated for any reason except I want it. And the reason that that is profoundly important is because it deals with the fundamental premise of the spiritual path. The fundamental premise of the spiritual path is that the way to find happiness and to relieve suffering is by increasing our awareness. Master, when he came to America in 1920, the first book he wrote was called The Science of Religion. And the premise of that book was very simple, which is all sentient beings are motivated by these twin desires to escape suffering and to find happiness. And another sort of parallel classic principle that runs through all of spiritual teaching is they often put it as wine, women, and gold. Of course, that would women is not really the issue. Women are not the problem, but it is the attraction to sensual experience. Sexuality being the primary one, but the desire to immerse oneself in the pleasures of the physical world. And so that's one. And gold represents the desire for money, which is actually the desire for power over the material plane, and to try to find security, again, find security by forcing the material world to conform to our desires. And power represented by money makes us think that we can do that. I mean, if we just, I'm not, those are not the two I'm talking about, but just to have that point clear, we think that money will give us freedom because we can then do in this world whatever we want to do. I've actually seen a number of unfortunate cases in my short span of life with people who inherited money at a very young age. Trust fund babies is what people used to call it, where you're in your 20s and you have all the money that you're ever going to need in your life. You have it already. And what I have seen, not always, but too often, is that such people never develop willpower. They never develop a strong spine, because every time things get a little difficult, they can just go do something else, because they don't have to work. They don't have to tie themselves down to any particular situation. They can just, if it gets a little tough, they can go somewhere else. And money, in the early years of Ananda, when we had very little money, it was very interesting to me to see how that would play in different people's minds. And for some people, they felt trapped because they didn't have any way to, because we were working. Ananda at that time, I would call it a giant mom and pop store. That's how I used to describe it. You know, where mom and pop just live above the shop, and they work long hours for very little pay, but they're working for themselves. They're building something up for themselves. But there's nobody there but them. All of Ananda, which was only Ananda Village at that time, was like a giant mom and pop store where everybody there just had to give everything they could and expect nothing back, because we were just investing in a future that we hoped would come about. And it's come about to an astonishing degree. We have never become as financially prosperous as an institution, as an organization, as we thought we might 30 and 40 years ago. But in every other way, we've been wildly successful in terms of helping people and expanding our reach and developing ourselves spiritually. So anyway, so money is one. Sensual experience, sexuality is another. And the third one is intoxicants, which is generally represented as wine, but nowadays intoxicants have countless other forms. And what that is about is, in this suffering and happiness, when we begin to suffer, there's this thought, if I could just take the edge off, if I could just, not have to feel this so deeply. So we come home from work and we're really stressed. The first thing people do, I don't say me because this has never been my particular story. You open the refrigerator, you take out a beer, you pour a glass of wine, you get that alcohol running through your system, and what does it do? It takes the edge off. That's what people say. You suddenly feel so relaxed. More relaxed. You suddenly can't remember why You were so stressed. You know, everything dulls down. It's not that we're rising into super consciousness and see it from God's point of view. It's just the opposite. It's like we don't feel anything as deeply as we felt it before. And of course, if we take sufficient alcohol, we really don't feel anything. We just get completely, we escape, just like that. But the problem is, of course, it wears off. The problem is, of course, it's a poison. And so gradually it takes away our physical health. And if we really follow alcohol, deeply, it makes us ever increasingly subconscious, which is, it takes away the filters, it takes away the conscious control, all these other things that we know. And psychedelics, or I don't know, marijuana, LSD, I don't even know what people take now. When we, and the only exception to this is what Swami himself observed in the late 60s. And Swami was always very much against all of these substances. He actually went so far as to say he could feel a dark energy around these things. But he had to admit that in the 60s, people often were stimulated to start their spiritual search by some psychedelically induced experience. I have to put myself in that category. I never had anything interesting happen, ever. I'm talking like 1966, maybe 65. 66 is probably was my 66 and 67. But I took psychedelic. I took the first thing I ever did to change my consciousness. I'd never had a beer. I'd never had anything. It was a strong dose of LSD. You might as well just, throw yourself into the deep end of the pool. And nothing interesting happened to me. In fact, the whole experience was actually quite unpleasant, which was pretty consistent with everything I ever tried in that level. But I realized that if you change your consciousness, you change everything. And that answered the question that I really had at that time. I was a freshman in college. Like, what is the secret here? And then I realized that consciousness was variable. I just didn't have the right words for it. And if you could shift your consciousness, you could shift everything. And then a couple of months later, I was introduced to the Vedanta philosophy of India. And because I knew now that consciousness was the key, now there was a science of consciousness, and I didn't convert. I woke up in a heartbeat just as soon as I knew what the rules were. My own personal drug experience, so to speak, of alcohol and drugs, which didn't last very long anyway. I was joking with my friends before we started here. The period of time when I was involved in that world, whenever I would take any psychedelics, and at that time, the people who took drugs were completely different from the people who drank alcohol, because alcohol dulled your consciousness where, in theory, psychedelics lifted it. And we just, it was unthinkable that you would do both. And now people just want to change their consciousness. I mean, at least that's what I've been told and I understand. For me, every time I would do anything that affected my mind, I realized all I would do is wait for it to wear off because I just didn't like having a substance come in and affect my consciousnness. And finally, of course, the obvious occurred to me. You don't have to wait for it to wear off. Just don't ever take it. And so I was a little dumb. It took me a while to get that. And I, of course, just stopped because I know that what I want is permanent change. I don't want to just escape for a few minutes and then have to deal with all the consequences of what that does to me, to my body, to my mind. Swami had a very interesting comment about marijuana. He said, the long-term effect of marijuana that Swami has observed is that it weakens your willpower. And I really, from my own experience, I had to think about that. And I realized what happens when you get intoxicated, whether you're, and I know almost nothing about alcohol. I literally drank hard liquor once in my life. And it was such a terrible experience. I mean, it was just an ordinary experience of being drunk, but it was so terrible to me to just be roiling around out of control in that world that I've never even considered it. But this is, thank you, God, past karma. You know, when we don't want to do something anymore, it's because we've been there, we've done it, we've reaped the consequences, and it simply doesn't attract us anymore. Because lowering our consciousness just postpones the inevitable necessity to raise it. And it also sets up within us this habit of mind, which is whenever I have a problem, I run from it. Whenever I have a problem, I run from it. When I need to exert energy and put out willpower to transcend this and see it from a higher level, instead I think I'll just take a drink, I'll just smoke a joint, I'll just pop a pill, and then I'll just drift around for a while. And then when it all wears off, I'll be exactly where I was before, except I'll have now developed another step in this habit of running from. This is Swami's comment about marijuana, but the other thing I realized about marijuana, and actually about drinking, all of it, is it gives you a mistaken sense that something's actually happening. What I remember with marijuana being stoned, which I don't know if these are still the same words, but that's the words we used, just even little things would seem really interesting. You know, wow, look at the book cover. I never really noticed what a really great book cover this is. You know, you just sort of, just kind of like, oh, look at the plastic bag. Oh, turn it upside down. And then everybody would, isn't that profound? Look at it upside down. It's just like nothing is happening, but you have this feeling that something is happening. And on occasion, and this is even Swami conceded this, on occasion, you do grab an insight that's so powerful that even after your consciousness is restored to its natural level, that becomes an impetus to go forward. And Swami had to concede that people did come on the spiritual path from those experiences. And it certainly directed me, but it wasn't the experience that directed me, it was the thought that you could change your consciousness. But what happens for that is you get out of the habit of putting out willpower, because where profound satisfaction comes is when we raise our energy to match the infinite potential that's in us. And it has to be said, that takes energy. And again, we have this fundamental delusion. See, this is the subconscious, conscious, superconscious. These are the three orientations of our awareness. Swami writes this up magnificently in his Superconscious Living course. And what we're working with in those three levels of consciousness, subconscious is everything that we've already done. And it's the storehouse of all our experiences, not only in this lifetime, but in all our previous lifetimes. Swami's defining these words for the sake of yoga practice, and not just as psychology explains it. Although, of course, there's some overlap. But subconscious is everything that we've already done, that we're comfortable in, that's familiar to us. It's not necessarily positive memories, but it's familiarity. For example, there was this woman who lived with us at Ananda Village for a period of time, and she came from a very, very troubled background. She was an example of someone who was from a very wealthy family, who had a trust fund from a very young age, but she'd been horribly raised, and her psychology was completely messed up. We helped her some, but she had a lot of karma to work out. But we tried to. I say we because she lived in the area where the nuns, where I lived with about 10 or 12 other women, and we took her in there and we tried to help her. And she was just very much of a rebellious, sort of spoiled, uncooperative person. And the one gal who really took her on was a sort of a strong, outspoken gal, and she would speak loud and firm to her She finally said, "Do you like it when I have to yell at you?" And the girl said, "Yes," she said. In her home growing up, the only way she could get her parents' attention was to misbehave, and they would yell at her. So when somebody yelled at her, it made her feel like somebody cared about her. So she would she was 35 years old. She would constantly do things that would get the people around her to yell at her. Now that's subconsciousness. It's not pleasant, but it's just the pattern that we've developed. And there's no creative growth in subconsciousness. There's lots of experiences. And I'm going to separate this out from sleeping dreams. There's lots of experiences, but we're just repeating. We're not getting bigger. Where we expand is on the superconscious level. Superconscious is creative. Superconscious is linked to our higher self. And when in our life experience we constantly seek to reach upward to a more expanded way of being. See, subconscious is totally contractive. It can rearrange all these pieces. You can find new people to yell at you, but it doesn't fundamentally change the first question, what causes suffering, what brings happiness? Whereas on the superconscious level, we begin to get a much more subtle idea of what causes us suffering, and we're given new creative ways to find happiness. Except we have to exert more energy in order to go into superconsciousness, where subconscious is like the default. Whenever we lower our energy, that's where we fall. We all experience this. We recognize that I have a repeating pattern of reacting to certain situations, a repeating pattern of looking for relationships that don't work for me, a repeating pattern of not cooperating with my own highest good. But it takes so much effort to do something else that we just hang around in that subconscious field. And when we intoxicate ourselves, which whatever substance we use, we just get to play around in the subconscious world. And if every time we feel a little bit of suffering, we retreat to subconsciousness, it takes away our capacity to raise our energy. The subconscious and the superconscious are the two choices we have: expansive versus contractive. Subconscious is contractive, superconscious is expansive. The third dimension, which is the conscious mind, is not really a separate reality. It is the field of struggle. It is the field of Kurukshetra. In the Bhagavad Gita, the war between the Pandavas, who represent the Krishna-inspired upward movement, and the Kauravas, which represent the material world, they meet in a battle to the death on the field of Kurukshetra. And the field of Kurukshetra is our consciousness, and where the subconscious and the superconscious forces interact. And so the conscious mind is where we struggle. That there's this impulse and this call, this literal call from our higher self to rise. And then there is this comfortable call from the subconscious, just don't bother. And the reason intoxicants are one of the major delusions is because that is the battle. And every time we intoxicate ourselves, we have the feeling that we've done something, because consciousness shifts. But consciousness shifts into this, it's a lie, is what intoxicants are. They're just simply a lie. They promise us a certain kind of relief and freedom, but they don't deliver. And this, of course, is the nightmare that happens to people who become, seriously addicted. Alcoholism being the most highly documented. The issues about marijuana and other psychedelics, are less known, but the oxycycline that's what it's called, that pill. It's not like even after a while that you even get any relief from it, but you have to keep taking it, because the consequences of not taking it draw you really into deep suffering. People who become alcoholic, it's just like their whole life becomes the only battle they have is just to stay out of that subconscious world. It's the dark force at its worst. And so within the context of, I am here for self-realization, I am here to transform myself into superconsciousness, I am here to respond to this eternal struggle between suffering and happiness by expanding my awareness and truly mastering those subconscious forces, not giving into them and releasing tension just by masking my experience one more time. They are simply opposites. So if one is seriously committed to the Ananda way of life, which is to expand our awareness, you just can't have it both ways. Now, we understand that people struggle. And within the context of Ananda, we are here to help each other, not to condemn each other and throw people out onto the street. So through the course of Ananda's long history, individuals who are sincerely fighting these, subconscious attractions, we work with each other. But there has to be a fundamental understanding that this is not acceptable. This is something that I wish to overcome. And we also, again, just out of our helping one another, we can't have in the middle of an ashram people who are committed, who are not committed to what the whole spiritual path is about. Now, I'm talking to a broader audience. I'm expanding this out to an Ananda way of life, not just those who are resident in community. So any of you to whom I'm speaking who have the habit of alleviating suffering by lowering your energy, by imbibing something that's going to shift your consciousness downward, consider very carefully whether or not that is really in your best interest to do that. And then how one is going to master it. Master spoke only about alcohol because the whole issue of drugs was not as central to society as it has become now. But Master said that a person should never even take one sip of alcohol. He did not believe that you should, introduce your children or anything like that, because he says you never know what you have in your past. You never know what addiction you might still be struggling with. And I know countless stories, well, not countless, but I know many stories, and I know there are countless examples. Somebody says, I was 13 years old and I picked up my mother's unfinished glass of whatever. I took 3 sips and I never stopped drinking. It's just like, oh yeah, I remember this. This dulls my awareness. I have a deep sympathy for this. I'm speaking very unequivocally, but I have a very deep sympathy for this. I think one of the reasons that I found it easy to turn my back on these things in this life is really because of that. Been there, done that. I remember at the existential moment just before I met Swami Kriyananda, standing in my apartment. I was living in San Francisco at the time, looking out over the backyard, feeling absolutely desperate, just like Thoreau. Most men live lives of quiet desperation. I was just standing there. I was desperate. By that point, I knew about changing consciousness, but I didn't know how to do it. And it was just like, now I knew what I was trying to accomplish, but I couldn't figure out how to implement it in my life. Very shortly after that, I met Swamiji, and that, sort of put me on the right path. But I remember standing there thinking, I could slip into madness, which I think I've also done. I could commit suicide, which I know doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work because you can't kill consciousness. You just shift to another level, and whatever problems you are facing, you still have to face, because it has to be expanded awareness. Or I could become a drug addict or an alcoholic or something like that. In other words, I can't stand it, I have to do something. And I do understand that. But we want to do that thing which really works. And we need to repudiate once and for all those false promises that actually lead to more, not less, suffering, and put ourselves on the only road to true happiness. God bless you, my friend.